Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming today. And I know it's running towards the end of the day and also towards the end of the conference. Glad to see you here. Appreciate your time that you're spending with us. And we want to talk to you today about deploying and managing Windows 8 with Configuration Manager using SP1. And we're going to really go through this. This is Jim Dempsey, Program Manager on our team, our Config Manager and Windows Intune team. We've merged. My name is DC Tardy. I'm also on the same team. And I want to go ahead and turn this over to Jim that's going to start after we talk about the objectives. Essentially, we'll work through the deploying pieces of Windows 8 using System Center Configuration Manager 2012 SP1. Yeah, I got it all out in one sentence. But additionally, we'll talk briefly about some of the advances that we've made there to also make ourselves a better citizen with the additions of the changes that we've made in the Configuration Manager client. And at this time, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jim Dempsey and take it away.
Thanks, DC. So I'm going to talk about deployment of Windows 8 using Config Manager, SP1. I'll go through basically what's new in SP1. There's actually a lot more than what is represented here. We put a lot of new stuff and enhancements and so forth into SP1. Those things will not be covered here unless they more or less tie to Windows 8, since that's kind of the theme. So I'll cover what's new related to Windows 8 deployment. There's a couple of things that aren't necessarily specific to Windows 8, but then I wanted to make you aware that there's also a handful of slides at the end of the deck that I will not cover that kind of goes into all the rest of the what's new stuff that I don't cover during the presentation. So you guys will have access to download that from ComNet. If you downloaded it previously, you'll want to re-download it because it was updated about 30 minutes ago, I think. So you want to go get that, and that'll have some additional content for you. So what are the things that we've added specific to Windows 8 deployment? We've added support to deploy Windows 8 and Windows Server 2012, as well as some roles, so I'll talk about that. The added support for the UEFI architecture. I'll talk a little bit about what that is, but mostly I'll talk about what that means to you from a deployment perspective. There are actually some other sessions. I think there's a session tomorrow morning, actually, that talks about BIOS and UEFI deployment. So you may want to catch that session if you're interested in that. We've updated our task sequence wizards, so I'll go through kind of what changes we made there. I've got a kind of generic bucket called additional OSD improvements. That's a handful of things that don't really fit into any one particular category, so I just kind of threw them into a lump there. And then updated pre-stage media, what we've done to make that experience even better. And then finally, I'll actually talk about what we've done to support Windows to Go provisioning. So the biggest change that you'll notice in Service Pack 1 with relation to OS deployment is the changes that were made to setup. So first of all, we no longer use the Windows AIK or Automated Installation Kit. That is for Windows 7. In order to support Windows 8 and Server 2012, we actually had to go with the Windows ADK, which is the Assessment and Deployment Kit. That has a new version of Windows PE, Windows PE version 4.0. And if you spend any time out on the TechNet forums or other blogs and things, you'll probably notice that there's been a bit of an uproar over that because with Windows 8, they took a change in the kernel where they don't support some older hardware that doesn't have certain capabilities. So we've been getting a lot of feedback on that. Unfortunately, in some cases, you can actually get a BIOS update from the hardware manufacturer that will allow you to support that. In other cases, that may not be available. So you want to be aware of that, and you want to make sure that you test that with your hardware in your environment and know what that impact is going to be before you get into full swing deployment. We've updated the default boot images, as I said, to use the new Windows PE 4.0. We do that automatically, but any custom boot images that you have, so if you've imported your own, then those will not be updated automatically. So what that means is that you'll have to go in and you'll have to update the data source path to point to the updated Windows PE and refresh those boot images. But we're trying to get to a point where nobody's really using custom boot images, meaning that they use our default ones that are in the box when you install a site, and then we're adding as much as we can for customization into the admin UI so that you can actually go and do those customizations through the console and not have to do those things outside in a manual manner. We know that there are a few things that people like to customize today that are not available in the UI, and we try every opportunity we get, like sessions like this, we try to get feedback on what are those things so that we can over time get those added in. One common one that we hear about is setting like keyboard settings or locales and stuff like that. So any feedback that you might have on what things you customize that aren't currently customizable in the console, we'd love to hear about them. You can post those out on the TechNet forum for OS deployment, or I'll actually be available at the speaker Q&A this evening, and you can come and talk to me and give me any suggestions that you have. The last thing here is that we actually, during setup of the site, will automatically create a user state migration tool package for you based on the new version of USMT for Windows 8. So what are the ADK requirements for setup? Well, this list may be a little bit much to read. It's here more so for a reference for you guys to go back and look at later. But a quick summary: we do require that you manually install the Windows deployment tools, Windows PE and User State Migration Tool. We have a prerequisite check that will tell you if you haven't already installed the ADK before you run setup. But because we're no longer able to redistribute the ADK, it is a manual thing that you have to go download and install on your own. So this will list out basically where do you need to install each of the different components. You don't need all of the components everywhere. The one item that I'll list out here specifically is User State Migration Tool. It says the top level site server. For most of you, that hopefully is a standalone primary site. For a small handful of you, you may have a CAS or central administration site, so it would go there. One other thing I'd like to point out is with regard to the prereq check. The prereq check will identify the requirements on the server that you're running on. So if you have a local SMS provider on your site server, it'll catch that piece for you. But if you're using a remote SMS provider, it will not catch that. So just be aware of that and make sure that you've installed the ADK there. Windows AIK, as I said, no longer used. The setup for Windows ADK doesn't block it if you already have Windows AIK installed, but it is not a supported scenario, so you do need to make sure that you uninstall the AIK before installing the assessment and deployment kit. So what support exactly do we have in SP1 for Windows 8 and Server 2012? Well, from a deployment perspective, as we've said a couple of times, it deploys just like Windows 7. There's not a lot of changes. The process is all the same. We've added a couple of new capabilities in the UI to add some functionality that is new in Windows 8. But basically, if you've deployed Windows 7, you won't have any problems deploying Windows 8. We also support the site system roles on State Migration Point and Distribution Point with Pixie on Server 2012. And on Windows 8, we support Distribution Point without Pixie. So I've got another chart here. Again, this is kind of a reference slide for you to go back to later. So this is with regard to the User State Migration tool. So we've got the new version. As I said, we automatically create that package for you. The version of USMT that's required is based on the destination OS. So what are you trying to deploy in the end? So basically, if you're deploying Windows 8 or Windows 7, you can use the USMT for Windows 8, which is created for you. If you're deploying Vista, you can use USMT 4.0, which came as part of Wake for Windows 7. You'd have to install that on a separate box and copy the files over to create your own package for that, though. Or if you did an upgrade from Config Manager 2012 RTM to SP1, then you may already have that existing USMT package and be able to leverage that. And then finally for Windows XP, if you have any XP still out there and you're still in break fix mode trying to get it out of your environment, but it's still there, then you'll need USMT 3.01 from the Microsoft Download Center. Okay, so what is this UEFI thing? It's Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. So it's basically just a fancy term for BIOS replacement. Older hardware leveraged BIOS, all the newer machines, basically anything that has Windows logo compliance or is Windows certified, that will have UEFI capabilities. Ultimately, your users will notice some faster boot times when using UEFI. And the main thing is that it's required for some new functionality. Specifically, a couple of examples are network unlock for BitLocker. Anyone familiar with that by show of hands? A few of you. So I think this is actually pretty cool. Basically, what it can do is you can set network unlock. And so if the machine boots up and detects that it's on the corporate network, then it can actually bypass the BitLocker PIN entry. So that's kind of a nice feature if you're trying to manage machines kind of off hours and they're on the corporate network. Another item is secure boot. So secure boot also requires UEFI. UEFI does require a different disk configuration. So if you're working with BIOS-based machines, those are based on MBR disks. So UEFI actually uses GPT disks instead. And it also requires a different partition configuration, which I'll cover in a couple of slides from now. Another big change is the operating system architecture has to match the architecture of the hardware. So a lot of you today may be used to this best practice of using a single x86 boot image, and that you can use that to deploy images to any of your machines, whether they're x86 or x64. Unfortunately, with UEFI, because you have to match the architecture, you can no longer do that, and you actually do have to work with both x86 and x64 boot images if you have a mix of that hardware. In the systems that are shipping today with UEFI, a lot of them are shipping with CSM support, or something called Compatibility Support Module, that basically allows them to emulate a BIOS mode. By default, if it's a Windows 8 certified machine, it will come pre-configured as UEFI. But if you have a mixture of hardware and you want to kind of manage them all in a same way, especially if you're used to using kind of that single x86 boot image, what you can do is you can go in and change the configuration to leverage the compatibility support module and boot in that legacy BIOS mode, which basically makes it behave the same as if it were running BIOS. I would expect that over time, machines that have that CSM module will probably go away in favor of just straight UEFI, just because it's additional complexity and additional cost to your hardware manufacturers. So here's another great reference slide. Don't try to read it. It's a little too much. But this just kind of shows you, the different BIOS, legacy BIOS versus UEFI, 32-bit versus 64-bit, and kind of what version of Windows is supported on those things. So again, these will be in the slide deck. You can go download that and have that to reference at any time. So in deploying to UEFI, we've added a new task sequence variable, underscore SMS TS boot UEFI. That task sequence variable, it's read-only. It is detected at the beginning of the task sequence and is set for you based on whether you booted into a BIOS mode or a UEFI mode. That task sequence variable is then leveraged later on as a condition on the task sequence steps, so that you can basically have one task sequence that will support both BIOS and UEFI, and then you can kind of switch as to like which steps in the task sequence will run based on the condition that's set for that variable. I mentioned previously that there's a new disk configuration required for GPT disks. There's a minimum of 3 partitions required for UEFI. There's a FAT32 boot partition. There's an unformatted Microsoft reserved partition. And then there's an NTFS operating system partition. Optionally, you guys, if you want a Windows recovery image you may want to create a fourth partition. We don't actually include that in our default partitioning configuration, but it's easy enough to add that to your task sequence if you want that. And then you would obviously be responsible for populating that partition with the recovery image that you want to use. There's no support for moving from BIOS to UEFI during a task sequence. And this goes back to the fact that we set that variable at the beginning of the task sequence, and it doesn't change throughout the course. So if you start the task sequence by booting into if you start the task sequence by booting into a BIOS configuration, and then you go through and you do the formatting and partitioning steps, and you go into reboot, expecting that you can lay down the image and have it then come back up in UEFI mode, not possible. So I think the session tomorrow may be talking about kind of how you can get around this potentially. I actually haven't had a chance to review that content, but from the topic statement, it sounds like that's kind of what they're getting after. But natively within Configuration Manager, we don't provide any kind of support to switch on the fly. And then finally, some special considerations for Pixie Boot with UEFI. I already mentioned the same architecture, x86 for x86 hardware, x64 for x64 hardware. Then you also need to know that there are some machines today, again, this is kind of that interim phase when we're moving between BIOS and UEFI. There are some machines today that have that compatibility support module and support both BIOS and UEFI, but they don't have a Pixie option ROM for UEFI. So you can boot from CD or from hard drive or whatever in either BIOS or UEFI, but for network boot for Pixie, you can only boot BIOS. This has only been a problem on a few different hardware models that we've seen, but we can't test every piece of hardware, so I can't tell you how widespread that is. But the impact of that basically is that if you have systems that are like that and you want to deploy them as UEFI, that means that you'll have to use media in order to boot those instead of using Pixie. So either CD, DVD media, or USB media. And then the last special consideration is that in Config Manager 2012 RTM, while we had added support in SP1, we had added support for UEFI Pixie Boot. It was limited to 64-bit Pixie. We did release a Cumulative Update 1 recently, and there was a fix in Cumulative Update 1 that supports 32-bit Pixie Boot. So if you have some of the newer tablet devices based on 32-bit UEFI, assuming that they support Pixie, which some of them still don't, but if they do support Pixie, you'll need the Cumulative Update 1 in order to allow that to Pixie Boot. So next I'll talk a little bit about what changes we've made to the task sequence wizards. So we've added automatic integration of the BitLocker steps if you are deploying Windows 7 or Windows 8, basically anything Windows 7 and higher. So it used to be that you'd have to add that manually. We now have just a simple checkbox in the wizard that allows you to say, yes, I want you to create the BitLocker provisioning steps for me. We've also done the same sort of thing with BIOS and UEFI as far as the partitioning steps. As I mentioned, we'll basically put two steps in there, one for BIOS partitioning configuration, one for UEFI, and then we'll switch based on a condition using that variable that I mentioned. And then finally, the build and capture scenario has been updated to apply an image. So previously, if you went through that build and capture wizard, there'd be a page that prompted you to specify an installer package. That actually is not a Windows supported thing, except for the version of the operating system that matches the WinPE version of the boot image. So we do still support setup.exe based installations of Windows 8 on Config Manager 2012 SP1, but anything earlier is not technically supported by Windows. So we have updated this wizard so that by default it'll actually prompt you to use an install image instead of an installer package. The good news is that as of Windows 7 and Windows 8, we do support use of the install WIM as a source for that install for that image. Yes, question? I know where you're going, yeah. So the question is about when you're deploying using the install WIM, do we still have that issue of not getting installed on the C drive instead of the D drive? I'll just cover that really briefly. We have resolved that by way of introducing a variable, I think it's OSD preserved drive letter. So if you look up details on that in TechNet, you should see how that can be used. It really only applies to Windows 7. Windows 8, they actually have changed the install WIM so that it installs to C by default. So you don't have to do anything special for Windows 8 deployment. Thanks for the question. It's almost as if I planted you there. That's good. Okay. So here's that catch-all bucket that I talked about. A few things that we've done that don't really fall into any specific category. So first of all, this is one of my favorite things that we've added, is the ability in the console to be able to choose additional Windows PE optional components to add to your boot images. So it used to be that you'd have to go and use DISM or the various command line tools to do that yourself. And now you can just easily select from a nice UI and say, hey, I want to add HTA support or I want to add PowerShell support. So I'll show you that when I get to the demo in just a moment. We've added the ability to export and import driver packages. So for those of you that follow the model of you've got a test environment and the production environment and you want to import your drivers and test them all in your test environment, and then once you're happy that it all works, you don't want to have to go recreate that in your production environment because you want to make sure it's exactly the same. Well, now you can go and you can export that package and it'll take all of the drivers that are part of that package, bundle them up, and then you can import those in the other environment. And then finally, for BitLocker, we've added a couple of new capabilities introduced in WinPE 4.0 and Windows 8. One called pre-provisioning, which basically means that we can set a property on the disk that says encrypt used space only. And we can set that property in advance while we're in Windows PE so that when we get to the encryption phase, we actually only encrypt the part of the disk that has data on it. What we've seen in our testing is that can take a process that used to be 3 to 5 hours to encrypt an entire disk down to about 5 minutes. So it's a huge, huge time savings. Great feature. And then the last item that we've added is PIN support. So you can use TPM plus PIN in your BitLocker enablement. One thing to watch out for there is that if you do enable PIN, that will take place wherever that's stuck within your task sequence. So that means that it will have an impact on your completely unattended zero-touch scenarios. So you'll want to be aware of that, that it will prompt, anytime it reboots and comes up, it will prompt for a BitLocker PIN if you've enabled that. So with that, I'm going to switch over to my demo system. And with any luck, everything will go really smoothly. So the first thing I wanted to show you was the user state migration tool for Windows 8. Not super exciting, but just wanted to show you that it is here, automatically created for you as part of setup. So you don't need to go create that package anymore. We will also, as you're going through the wizards and configuring the capture capability, we'll actually pre-populate that package name in there so that if you want to use the default, you don't even have to make a change on the page. You can just click next and go through the wizard. The next thing is the boot image optional components. So actually, I'll do it here. So you'll see here that we have this new tab called Optional Components. And up at the top of this dialog, you'll see that we actually have 4 items that are included in the boot images by default. You can't remove those because those are required. But down in the bottom here, we have, if you click the little starburst icon, it'll pop up another dialog so that we can see the list of available components. And so you can scroll through that list, and if you want to install HTA support, I can actually go down here, select HTML, HTA. Maybe I want to also add PowerShell support, so I can go down here, select Windows PowerShell. And this is then prompting me because I selected PowerShell, it has a dependency on the .NET component as well. So it prompts you and says, hey, you're going to have to add the .NET component in order to support that. So I can then just click OK, and now it shows that all 3 of those will be added into my boot image. So really nice way to do that without having to go and do that manually at the command line anymore. So now let me run through the task sequence wizards and show you those changes. So first I'm going to go and do the install an existing image package to show you what that one looks like. And I need to select boot image. All of this so far is the same. Select my image package. And then here's the new stuff here. Right, we have partition and format the target computer before installing the operating system. That will go, if you have that checked, it'll go ahead and pre-create those 2 steps for the BIOS and UEFI partitioning. And then the second checkbox there is configure task sequence for use with BitLocker. That'll put all of the necessary BitLocker steps into your task sequence. So I'm going to cancel out of that. And then I'll run the build and capture reference. All right. And so again, it's just prompting me for boot image. And selecting the image that I want to include. So this is where it's prompting, instead of for the installer package, it's prompting for the image that you want to install. So as I said, if you are deploying Windows 8, we do support setup.exe installations still. So if you want to use that method, what you'll have to do is step through this wizard to the end, have it save the task sequence using an image. Again, you can, as an interim measure, you can choose the install WIM if you don't have another WIM file. And then when you're finished, you can go into the task sequence editor, remove that step that installs the image, and replace it with one that installs an installer package for Windows 8. So, okay. So next I'm going to edit this task sequence and show you these steps that I mentioned for format and partition. So you'll see here that on the BIOS step, down at the bottom under volume information, we have 2 partitions. It's the 350 megabyte NTFS system reserve partition, and then the remaining space is partitioned for Windows for the operating system as NTFS. Then on the UEFI step, oops, sorry, I just hit the wrong thing. On the UEFI step, there we see that we have multiple partitions. Right, we've got the recovery partition, an EFI partition, system reserve partition, and then the Windows partition. And I think I left one of those out on my slide earlier, so sorry about that. But if you did want Windows recovery image, then you would need to add that in. And then the last thing that I'll show you here is I mentioned that task sequence variable that's used to control which one of these steps runs. So there you see SMSTS boot UEFI equals true. So that'll trigger the UEFI step. And then we have the same statement or condition in the other step, except setting it equals to false. So in that basically ensures that it'll only run one of these steps depending on which firmware type you have. And then the last item to show you in this part of the demo is the BitLocker. Sorry, we've got enable BitLocker. And down here we have the option for TPM plus PIN. So this can either be hard-coded, which isn't really super practical. You probably don't want the same BitLocker PIN on all of your systems in your environment. So there is a task sequence variable that you can use to control that on a case-by-case basis. What you probably want to do is maybe add a pre-start command that includes some HTA that pops up and prompts for a PIN. Then when they enter that in, you can set that to the task sequence variable. I think it's OSD BitLocker PIN, if I remember correctly, but again, that one you can look up on the TechNet documentation. Okay. So that's it for the first demo. How am I doing on time? Looks like I'm doing okay on time. I might actually let DC speak today. So the next item I want to talk about is the pre-stage media improvements. So basically what we've done in SP1 is prior to SP1, pre-stage media basically allowed you to put down the operating system image, right? It'll let you lay down the WIM file, and that was pretty much it. So what that lacked was, typically we'll have a bunch of applications and things that you also want to include, and so you couldn't do that previously. So we've actually added the capability in SP1 that you can add additional applications, additional packages, and additional driver packages into that pre-stage media, so that all of that content will be available when the task sequence is running, and it won't have to necessarily reach out to the network to go download all of that. The way that'll work is basically the task sequence will check the local task sequence cache for the valid content first, and if it finds it there, it'll use it. If it doesn't find it there, maybe maybe you didn't add it to the pre-stage media. Maybe you're actually deploying a different task sequence than what you created the media off of. Maybe something happened and the hash has become corrupt on that file. In that situation, it'll actually go out and download the necessary content from the distribution point. So the one thing I wanted to call out, if you're not familiar with pre-stage media already, pre-stage media is not tied to the task sequence that you use to create it. Basically, when you go through the create media process for pre-stage media, it prompts you for a task sequence, but that's not used to say this is the task sequence that's going to run. That's used basically as a reference to say what content do you want to populate. So at runtime, basically, you can still get new policy that tells you to run a different task sequence. And most of the time, you're probably going to want to use the same task sequence, but it's not a requirement. Let's see. So I think I already covered all that. So Windows to Go. How many, by show of hands, how many of you know what Windows to Go is? Wow, awesome. Very good. Now, how many of you are actively interested in using it? About a third of the people that are aware of it. Okay. So what we wanted to do in SP1, we worked really closely with the Windows to Go team over in the Windows product group to see how we could streamline the provisioning process for Windows to Go drives. For those of you that don't know what Windows to Go is, basically it gives you a portable workspace. So it gives you a full installation of Windows and your apps and your settings all on a portable drive. Whether it's a USB flash drive or there's some that come in a very small USB hard drive form factor based on SSD flash. So it's a great way to meet a whole bunch of new evolving scenarios, like bring your own device. You want to travel light, you don't want to take a PC, you can just take a USB stick with you and have your workspace kind of anywhere you go. So we wanted to figure out, okay, how can we help basically allow self-provisioning by the user, right? The user has some USB stick, but they need to be able to provision that so that they can go and use that for Windows to Go. The basic process that we go through is that we leverage the existing task sequence that you already have for your Windows 8 deployment, same one that you're using to go deploy Windows 8 to all your physical PCs in your environment. And we combine that with the concept of pre-stage media. And then we worked with the Windows to Go team to build a Windows to Go creator tool, which we also include in the box with SP1. I'll show you that as well. And so that Windows to Go creator package gets included along with the pre-stage WIM file that you create from your main task sequence. And then we can use that to provision the pre-stage media onto the Windows to Go drive. Then when the user plugs that in and boots off of it for the first time on CorpNet, it'll go and run the task sequence from all of the content that's already there pre-staged locally on the Windows to Go drive, so that basically they can, all of the time that's used to download the majority of that content is done while they can still be productive. Basically, they can continue using their PC to do other things while the content is coming down and being pre-staged onto that media, and then that minimizes the downtime so that they don't have to be downloading content while they're provisioning the device. And then as far as management of Windows to Go, so we've also made a change. This isn't specific to deployment, but in terms of management of Windows to Go, we've actually made some changes in the client to support Windows to Go. We actually don't support putting a configuration manager client on a Windows to Go drive with RTM or with Config Manager 2007, and the reason being that there are some issues with basically the unique identifier. The Windows to Go drive can actually kind of take over the identity of the host operating system it was provisioned on, and then you end up with kind of a mess there. So we don't support that on 2007. We do support that on 2012 with SP1, and we've specifically added a new property into the client. I think it's called Portable Workspace or something like that, but I'll show that to you in the demo as well. That if it's set to true, that tells you that a particular client is a Windows to Go drive. So with that, I will go through my last demo here. So I mentioned that we're going to use the existing task sequence that we've already used to deploy in the enterprise. So I've got this task sequence that we just looked at a little bit ago, and I've already got that deployed out to my systems in my enterprise. And what I want to do is I want to create pre-stage media from that. So I'll go ahead and create task sequence media. Oops. Thank you. All right, I'll go back just to catch that. So I've selected my task sequence that I've got deployed out there, and I'm going to go create task sequence media. And here I see the option to create pre-stage media, right, which creates a file to be pre-staged on a new hard drive, blah, blah, blah. And I'm going to allow unattended operating system deployment. I'll just use site-based media for this demo. Here I need to choose where I want to create the pre-stage media file. So I'll just type in prestage.wim. That's probably not where you'd want to put it normally, but that's okay. Here I'm going to enable unknown computer support. I'm going to remove the password protection. Maybe you want to use that in production environment to protect the media. And then down here I'm going to enable the ability to use user device affinity. So I need to choose a task sequence. I'll choose the task sequence that I had there, which shows me all of the content that is associated with that. I don't know if you can see all that in the back. So it lists out, we've got the configuration manager client package, the boot image, the operating system image, and a couple of packages or applications that I've added myself to the image, or to the task sequence rather. Sorry. So the question was, what's the storage requirement for Windows to Go? Not sure what you mean by that, but come see me afterwards and we can talk about it. I'm guessing whatever it is that it varies, but there are specific Windows to Go drives from specific manufacturers that are certified for Windows to Go, and they come in specific sizes. So maybe that answers your question, but if not, just come see me afterwards. So here I'm going to choose the distribution point where my boot image is located. Choose my management point and select the image that I'm going to deploy. And then here is where you can see that we have the ability to select additional applications. So in my task sequence, I currently have a reference to the Adobe Reader application that I'm deploying, and I can actually, if I decide, hey, maybe that changes too frequently, and by the time someone actually uses this media, it'll be out of date. Maybe I don't want to include that on the media. I can simply remove that. If I had other applications in my environment, then I could just click Add and add additional ones. So it's not tied just to the things that are in the task sequence. And then for the package, you see that I have references to the client package and a BitLocker for Windows to Go package, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Again, I can add and remove as I desire, and same thing with driver packages. I can add additional driver packages. So I'm not going to complete this wizard because I've actually already created my pre-staged media. So the next thing I'll show you is actually, there's a couple of tools that we shipped with SP1 to help with the deployment of Windows to Go. Again, we worked with the Windows to Go team on this, so they helped provide a lot of the code. The first one is the creator tool. And as far as where this is located, basically under wherever you installed your site server, which by default is Program Files Microsoft Configuration Manager, there's an OSD Tools WTG folder. So that's where you'll find these. And then the creator tool is very similar. If you're already familiar with the inbox creator tool that comes with Windows 8 Enterprise, it's very similar in terms of the interface. It basically comes up and prompts you to select a Windows to Go drive that you want to provision, and then can also prompt whether you want to select a BitLocker password for that. So the creator tool is a special version of that specifically for config managers so that we can kind of automate the process. Basically, we can specify command line parameters to automate that. But it's very similar to the inbox tool. Then the other tool that we include is this BitLocker, OSD BitLocker WTG executable. There's one for x86 and one for x64. And basically, because Windows to Go drives can't leverage TPM, they have to have some other mechanism to do BitLocker. And so this tool allows you to actually use a password as a protector for your Windows to Go drive. So you can basically create a package out of this tool, include that in your task sequence, which I had added a step for that in my task sequence, and then it'll run as part of that provisioning process to enable BitLocker on your Windows to Go drive. So the question is, can you use that to provision BitLocker on older hardware that doesn't support TPM? The answer is no, that's not a supported use. Okay, so with that, what I need to do is, so I've already created my pre-staged WIM file, and what I need to do then is to create a package that has the Windows to Go creator and my WIM file. So basically all I did is I created a folder, source folder, copied my pre-staged WIM file in there, copied that creator.exe tool in there, and created a package out of that. And then if I look at the program properties, so you can see here that we're calling WTG creator.exe /WIM : the name of the WIM file. You don't need a path because it's in the same folder with your creator tool. And then I just have to scroll over a little bit here. And then there's an additional parameter called enable boot redirect, which actually allows you to enable the Windows to Go launcher. So if you're not familiar with the launcher, basically what that does is it reconfigures your system to allow it to automatically boot to a Windows to Go drive if it detects one, so that you don't have to hit F1, F2, F12, whatever it is for your specific hardware model, and then choose from the boot list as to which one you want to use. So this only works if your host OS is Windows 8. It will not work on older host OSs. So basically, I've created that package. I then want to deploy that out to all my users. So most of you, if you're used to doing OS deployment, you know that we deploy to devices, not to users. Well, in this case, because we're deploying a package, not a task sequence, we actually have the ability to deploy to users. And what that means is that you can put this Windows to Go provisioning scenario in a place that customers and users are already used to going to get other software. So if they normally go to the application catalog to install Adobe Reader or whatever application it is that they need to use, they go to the same place to go get this Windows to Go creator, and then they can provision their drive that way. So I've already got that deployed to all users. Then I'm going to switch over here to my client machine, which I've already launched the application catalog, and you see here that I have an entry for Windows to Go creator. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that and click the install. And so it gives you this little prompt. Are you sure you want to install the selected application? Yes, I do. And after a little bit, we should see the launcher application show up. Here it is. Sorry, not the creator application show up. So here you can see this is exactly the same interface that you would see with the inbox creator tool. Prompts you for a drive. It'll show you a list of drives that are detected on the system. I do have one USB device here that meets the requirements. And then I would click next and continue provisioning. So I'm not going to actually do the provisioning, but that is kind of the end-to-end process for setting that up so that end users can provision their own Windows To Go drives. Awesome. So I'm going to just quickly step back here, and one other thing that I wanted to show before I turn it over to DC is if I go to this client and look at properties, scroll down just a little bit, here's that property that I was telling you about, portable operating system equal true. So what that means is the client, named client, is actually running as a Windows To Go drive, not as a physical machine. And so in terms, I talked a little bit earlier about different use cases for Windows To Go, travel light, bring your own device, that kind of thing. One thing that I didn't mention is MMS demo on a stick. So everything that I did here today was all run off of a USB Windows To Go drive, self-contained without any network connectivity. So. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to DC to talk about managing.
So we've been blasting the marketing and commercials. You've probably seen this commercial before. Has anybody seen this commercial before? Made for a good transition, didn't it? Give me a little bit of time to come up on the stage. But specifically, I wanted to talk to you today about some of this information. Has anybody ever heard of Intel's Clover Trail chip? Very few, so maybe about 20% of the audience have heard about that. We're going to go into some detail about what Intel Clover Trail gives you, but more specifically, in the overview of what I want to talk about today is additional to the Intel Clover Trail, what have we done to improve the client for Configuration Manager through SP1? We have focused on making it a better citizen. So we've taken advantage not only of some of the new hardware features provided by Clover Trail and what was announced this week by Intel, their follow-up called Bay Trail. We're also taking advantage of the obvious Windows 8 improvements of the automated maintenance task. And we'll get through that as we go through our conversation today. As you've seen here, there's just some samples of some devices that are available today. I'm talking specifically about the Clover Trail. I've got up here on the left hand, to your right, my Windows Surface RT device. Over here, I've got an Intel Clover Trail device. You can see I'm not selling hardware, don't want to sell hardware, but I do want to tell you that it's very, very similar. But from the perspective of what you can do on Clover Trail, this thing's been on standby, I think, for about a week and a half. And I know you can't see the battery, but the battery here has been on this Clover Trail device. Its battery's got about 90% left. And I've used it some. And so we take advantage of the hardware capabilities there to help save the battery life, in addition to the ARM features that are available on Windows RT Surface that allow you to save the battery as well. talking about what's the differences between these devices and how you can understand the agent itself and configuration manager and how it takes advantage of it. So always on, always connected, really focuses on using this Intel Clover Trail technology to use the system on chip technology to save the battery life essentially and be able to keep your devices managed with the configuration manager agent. Now, some of the devices are, the specific scenario here is connected standby. And what does that mean? So most everyone has some form of smartphone. This one happens to have my family's picture on here, and when I push the button here, it's obviously live. I can log in and I can do application management. The same I want you to think about on these devices. When they go off, they go into connected standby mode, and therefore only a few applications are still active, just like your smartphone. Email, you still get email coming in, you get your IMs, you get your telephone, that type of thing. So just think about connected standby on your devices, much like a smartphone that keeps your behavior. So behavior is very similar across these devices. So why do we not use the standby or hibernate modes? That's because certainly you don't get those added features of the connected standby mode with email and VoIP and IM. Likewise, it's also more time. It takes more time to boot up the system or start the system when you've got the standby or hibernate. And so we can opportunistically power down these devices. Simply, Windows 8 does this through your idle time and so on and so forth, moving down. And then most of the time on the low idles, we have mostly idle scenarios. And that's the scenarios that we address with the configuration manager, with the connected standby here is applications are throttled. So when it goes into this black mode, this black screen mode, the application itself really receives very little time to actually run. So maybe 2 minutes in a 60-minute or an hour time frame that an application actually gets to run. Some of the key points that I need to state here is with Configuration Manager SP1 client, we've met all the Windows 8 certification requirements for connected standby, but also at the same time remember that it's like a smartphone behavior, and then additionally when the screen is off, you've got the throttling of the applications like I just described that occur in the background. Here's kind of a timeline. So if you think of your normal day, let's just say you've got a standard 8 to 5 day of work, and you have your device, and you take your device with you, and you go to meetings, and you come back, and then you go to meetings, and you come back. You're going to have maybe half of the time for that particular device that it goes down into after 8 minutes of time when the user is not actually touching the device and making the screen be live, that it will go into this connected standby mode and be able to preserve that battery life. Additionally, what we're taking advantage of in Configuration Manager Agent for SP1, we've added these features to also take advantage of the Windows Automatic Maintenance. Now, this goes all the way back to Vista SP2 that we support this. So this is where the Configuration Manager Agent and SP1 can take these advantages. And you know, automatic maintenance occurs once every night at 3 a.m. by default. I guess that's in the morning. So it's usually night when I'm sleeping, so I called it night. But anyway, additional to this, the conditions though, we've got a few functions that are available. Now these functions are available from Windows 8 to take advantage of by third-party applications. This is what Configuration Manager Client takes advantage of as well. but it meets these conditions in order to manage your devices. So when Windows comes up for that automatic maintenance time frame, you've got to we detect about AC connectivity, or AC connected, whether it's idle, and whether there's network connectivity or not. And so it's capable of waking the device so that we can actually do maintenance during this time frame so that we don't not do maintenance. Double negative. So we actually perform the maintenance for you when the devices are off and follow the Windows 8 compliance to do this during the automatic maintenance windows. So the changes, what I skipped over here on this one is we are doing this to be a better citizen. So you see here on the right here, you see the different schedules, if you will, or the actions that we take during this time period. I've got an eye chart here in just a minute that kind of gives you a table listing of the type of activity that we perform during the Windows automatic maintenance and why we perform it. I'll give you an example of why we actually perform it. And we make these changes to make sure that the agent performs better and provide you with a better experience in certain cases and states. So in these conditions, it's a list of all the conditions that we have. However, I'm only going to touch on one. You can download this later and read it in more detail. But for instance, in discovery data, really we need network. So we're detecting the fact that there's network. And we can do this whether it's on battery or not, but we're checking to see if there's low battery or high battery, that type of thing, whether it's idle and it's during the maintenance mode. So we're actively participating in keeping track of, or actually honoring what Windows maintenance does instead of just barreling ahead like we have done with our client in 2007. However, your question may come to mind, what happens about starvation? What if during the automatic maintenance mode time frame we can't get all of the activities completed? We will, after 3 days, go ahead and do our maintenance that's required through the Configuration Manager client. Bottom line here, be a better citizen on all of the operating systems. And again, I'll just go back to saying we made these updates all the way back to the Vista SP2 version. So you can take advantage of these improvements all the way back there. So the guidance that we have taken here with meeting the automatic maintenance for Windows 8 perspective, we have passed all the certifications required by Windows to make sure that the client behaves properly, and checking all of those conditions that I showed you previously and making sure that we adhere to that to be compliant. But obviously, after that 3-day period, we go ahead and make sure that we get our maintenance completed. Now, additional to this, we've made some additional improvements that are optimizing the agent so we use less memory. And we've done some more optimization so we use less battery. Therefore, you're getting improved client management on Windows 8 in these cases. Just some clear characteristics of what happens in these different form factors and give you an idea of how we manage for the RT, for the Pro, Win 8, and for always on and always connected. So always on, always connected essentially would give you, well, I've got a separate line here, obviously, because it comes in many different form factors. And that's the reason why it's up there next to the RT and the Pro and Windows 8 in particular. The Windows 8, as I'm trying to present here, represents your laptop like this here or a desktop. So that's like a representation here that I've listed here. So if you've who's looked at Paul Thoreau's blog? Okay, Paul Thoreau's blog, he's done some testing, and that's where some of this information has come from, specifically on boot time and heat and noise and so forth. But the boot time information, you get a lot better boot time when you are in the always on, always connected, using that feature set from Intel. But the target, of course, for your Windows RT is for the consumer, and then the rest of these are for your consumer and for your enterprise clients. These are just some quick capabilities that just kind of pointing out here as abilities that you get with the different technologies that I've listed across the top. And you kind of see here that in general, we have the enterprise capabilities on the right. It's pretty straightforward from domain join capabilities and group policy capabilities. Your costs are a little bit higher on the Surface Pro, but for these other devices, they're not so high, kind of like the Windows AOAC, Intel AOAC device. And then, of course, for the additional capabilities that are available to you on these devices. I'm going to click through here pretty quickly so we can get to some questions as well, and making sure that you understand the capabilities that are here. The biggest thing I wanted to point out in this slide is the multi-user support. You might be asking, what in the world does that mean when we talk about multi-user support on the Windows Surface RT device? Well, that's managed strictly by Windows Intune through our modern device management, and a single user can enroll from the RT device. That's the only user that can be managed from that RT device. I know it allows for multiple users to log on, but one enrollment per device is capable on the RT. However, for the obvious reasons on Pro through Win8 and AOAC devices, they provide you with the ability to go ahead and have domain join, and multiple users are identified appropriately. So at the end of this, customer choice on what you actually will decide to have in your environment is unknown. So I leave this with an emphasis here, the ellipsis. What are you going to choose? It's your choice, and there are lots out there, and I hope that you are able to understand that what I really want to give you is we've added these capabilities to the Configuration Manager agent to provide you with, make it a better citizen across Windows 8, even back to Vista SP2. All right? Thank you very much. We'll take time for some questions at this point. Please go to the microphone so we don't have to repeat the questions if you can. Thanks. Any questions out there? OSD questions? Excellent. Thank you very much. Appreciate your attendance.